Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Reagan, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to the National Association of Christian Financial Consultants at your regional conferences. I guess there's 3 of them going on. And let me explain the setting that I'm in. I'm in the studio that I use when I do Fox Business with Varney and Company, which I usually do every Wednesday morning. For those of you who see me, thank you very much for watching. Those of you who don't, you can find me on Fox Business with Varney on Wednesday mornings and Megyn Kelly on Fox News on Tuesdays normally. But it's my honor, my pleasure to be there with you today. Well, be there at least in spirit, because I can't be in 3 places at once, even though sometimes you try to be in the industry and the business that I am in fact in. It's very important what you're doing, and I was asked to say a few words today. I know you're all eating lunch at this time, and so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about my father, and a little bit about how they all blend together, and we can work together towards the betterment of what you do and the betterment, of course, of the world that we live in today. As you know, I am the son of Ronald Reagan. I'm also the son of Jane Wyman. A lot of people forget that when you have a famous father, that you actually also had a mother. When I was growing up, I was Jane Wyman's son because she was the big to-do in Hollywood back in the 1940s and 1950s. So back then, I didn't have a father. Now I don't have a mother. So it's very interesting, the world that I live in. And what's really tough about that world is sometimes that it's tough for you to find your own space, to find out who you are, because you have such iconic people who are your parents that when you are successful, people say, well, you were only successful because. And when you fail, they say what? They say, well, you should never have been successful in the first place. I kind of tell a story with everybody, kind of my life, that I could walk into a bank, rob the bank, shoot the tellers, walk out of the bank, and the police officer that would be arresting me for robbing and shooting the people in the bank, the first thing he would do is ask for a photo and an autograph. Then as he was putting my head down to put me in the back seat of the police car, he would say to me, who do you think is going to win in 2012? That's the world I live in. There are things that are so important around my life, they forget about my life. So a lot of you don't know that at one time I did radio for 26 years. I was a powerboat champion back in the 1960s, and again in the 1980s. I've written 7 books in my life, one of them at least being a bestseller, On the Outside Looking In, which I penned back in the 1980s. But again, people forget that in fact I had a life other than just being the son of Ronald Reagan. And it was an interesting life to be raised in. Because my parents, as well off and well-to-do as they were, instilled values into their children. Well, some of their children, I might say. And my sister Maureen and I, raised by Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan, it was an interesting life. But the values they instilled in it were exceptional because those are the values that you remember all the way through your life. I remember at 8 years of age and driving out to the ranch with my father and being raised in Beverly Hills with the Bob Hope children, the Bing Crosby children, and a lot of these so-called rich kids, and yeah, I guess we were. My father was only giving me $1 a week allowance. And that was pretty cheap. I mean, how do you keep up with the Hope kids and the Crosby kids and all the other rich kids in Beverly Hills on $1 a week from your parents? And so riding out to the ranch on one Saturday, I said to my dad, hey, Dad, how about a little larger allowance? Now, my father was one of those people, and maybe you know someone like that too, where you ask them what time it is, and they tell you how the watch was made. My dad was one of those people. He was a storyteller. My dad was someone who spoke to you in parables. Today's politicians, of course, speak to us in sound bites. But he spoke in parables because he was so steeped in biblical principles, so steeped in the Bible. And after all, his mother, Nat'l, was a Sunday school teacher. My father was a Sunday school teacher. So he knew how to tell or talk about an issue by telling a story, telling a parable. So instead of saying yes or no to me, 8-year-old kid, he decided to, tell me a story. So for the next 35 to 40 minutes riding out to the ranch, yes, I did want to jump out of the car, but I thought that was too dangerous. I sat there and listened to my father talk to me about the tax system in America. An 8-year-old, listening to a father tell him about the tax system. And he told me how the government was taking 90 cents out of every dollar. And all that was left to him was 10 cents. And with that 10 cents, he had to take care of his first wife, my mother Jane, of course, myself and my sister Maureen, his new wife Nancy, their new daughter Patty, their house that they live in, the ranch, the horses, the cows, and the foreman. Well, I felt so sorry for him. Riding into the ranch that day, I actually offered back half my allowance to my father. And my father said to me, no, you don't have to do that. But I'll make you this promise. I said, well, what's that? He said, when there is a president elected who in fact gives me a tax break, I will in fact increase your allowance. Well, lo and behold, I find myself becoming very political at the age of 8, 9, and 10, waiting for that president to be elected so I can get a larger allowance. Well, it would take until 1960s when John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States. And then his tax system put into place by the surviving vice president who became President Lyndon Johnson back in 1964, decreased my father's taxes. And when that happened, my father stayed true to his promise. And the promise was to give me a larger allowance. So my dad increased my allowance from $1 to $5. Well, I was in high school. Didn't seem like much, but it was keeping a promise that he kept to an 8-year-old child. See, that's what Ronald Reagan was about. Keeping a promise. Staying true to what he has told to an 8-year-old child. And he was like that all through his life, Ronald Reagan was. My mother also was there to instill in me the work ethic, how important it was to work for the things that you really loved and really enjoyed. Because I went to boarding school as a child, and many of my friends went also, we tried to make our parents feel guilty. And by making them feel guilty, we felt, hey, we'll get something in return. You will buy us something to kind of relieve your guilt. And so everybody around me was getting a 10-speed bike. Schwinn had just come out with it. And there were brand new bikes all over the place. And parents were buying them for their children. And I went down to a cyclery close to our home, and I found this beautiful blue 10-speed Schwinn bike. And I went to my mom. I said, Mom, I found this bike, and you got to buy it for me. And my mother said to me, why? I said, because if you buy it for me, I'm going to love you forever. I'm sure none of you have ever heard that from any of your children. And my mother said, well, how badly do you want it? I said, I want it more than anything in the world, Mom. And my mom said this, do you want it bad enough to get a job? I said, Mom, I'm 10. I'm 10 years old. She says, I know. You can deliver papers. I never thought about getting a job to get that bike. But what I said to my mom, I said, Mom, how do I do that? So my mom and I looked in the paper and found that I could sell papers outside of our church, Good Shepherd Church in Beverly Hills, on Sunday morning. There was a stand available. And with the profits I made from that, I could pay her back for the loan she was going to give me to buy that bike. So at 10 years of age, I signed a note with my mother to pay her back for the bike that she was purchasing for me. And I started selling papers, and I paid her back. But I asked my mom, why are you forcing me to get a job to pay you back when all the other kids my age are getting bikes given to them by their moms and dads? She said very simply this, because I build men, I don't build boys. I said, what does that mean? She says, Michael, I have enough money to give you everything and anything you'll ever want. But if I do that, you'll be a 40-year-old child. But if you learn now that you have to go to work and work hard for the things that you want, you'll be a 40-year-old man. I build men, not boys. Well, I paid her back for that bike and learned a wonderful lesson. But I would kid my mother over the years because I would go to her when I did reach 40 and say to my mom, Mom, I'm now 40. We've done it your way for all these years. How about giving up some of those dollars? Well, my mother never did. She made me earn every dollar I ever had. And when I started my radio talk show in the 1980s, my national show, I had to drive to San Diego and back every single day to do the show. It was a 262-mile drive every single day. And I remember calling my mother one day on the road, and there was no money coming in. We were just starting the show. We had 5 stations. 4 of them were tape delayed. 1 was live. And the one live one had Monday Night Football. So on Monday night, I was actually talking to no one when I was doing the show. In fact, the producer of the show would go outside the building, call the show on a payphone, and pretend to be Bob from St. Louis. And they always start with, love your show, long-time listener, first-time caller. Well, Bob was the producer. His name was actually Paul. And we would talk for a few moments. Then his wife would call from the same phone and be Mary from Atlanta. So people listening to my show thought the show was from all over the country. And it was actually a very small show at the time. But that show lasted quite a few years, about 16 years. I called my mom on the phone one day, as I said, to say to my mom, I need some help. The kids are in school. Colleen's going to work. Could you help me out? And I said, I really need some financial help. And she says, I have an idea. And I said, what's that, Mom? She said, shut up and keep driving. I said, what? She said, shut up, keep driving. Who died and said you didn't have to pay your dues? You need to pay your dues just like everybody else, because the only way you'll know success is if you know failure. You have to pay your dues. So shut up and keep driving. She hung up on me. That was in 1993. And I walked away from radio in 2009 because I really got too busy. I'm doing too many things like this. And with my Reagan Legacy Foundation to, in fact, do radio 3 hours a day and then prepare to do radio 3 hours a day. So I learned great lessons from my parents that they carried all the way through their lives. My mother, Jane Wyman, in fact, was buried as a Dominican nun to the Third Order back in 2007 when she passed away. We were baptized Catholic in 1954, December 8th. My mother never missed a day at church from the time she was baptized until the day she died, and she was buried in full regalia. My father never missed a Sunday in church until he could no longer go because of Alzheimer's disease. And then the minister would go to my father, and the ministers would always say, I went to minister to Ronald Reagan, but Ronald Reagan, in fact, ministered to us. My father never forgot who he was and the foundation of his life. And it was that very foundation that, in fact, caused such a sea change in the world when he became president of the United States of America. All he was able to accomplish, he was able to accomplish because of his undying faith in the Lord and God. Back in 1981, all of you remember, as we do in the family, when my father was shot. It was really a wake-up call. He was the first president to ever be shot and survive an assassination attempt. And my dad never forgot that. It was quite a day in the Reagan family. My dad, learning on the news, of course, that he was shot. My family at home, media around our house, trying to get a plane together to get back to D.C. to see my father. We'd be flown out late at night on a C-130 back to Washington, D.C., arriving in Washington, D.C. early in the morning. We would go see my father at 10 o'clock in the morning at the hospital. And my dad, everybody knew his humor. He had great humor. And remember the humor of that day. Nancy, I forgot to duck. I hope everybody in this room is a Republican. Keeping everybody at ease. And Ronald Reagan was very good at that. Making everybody else feel at ease in his presence. And he was able to accomplish much in that way. But here was my father laying in a hospital bed as my wife Colleen and I and the kids walked in. I looked at my father. I said, good morning, how are you? And my dad said, well, I'm fine, thank you. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. And he said, well, Michael, if you're ever going to get shot, don't be wearing a new suit. I said, what? Well, you know, yesterday I was shot. I said, everybody in the world knows you were shot yesterday, Dad. Well, I was wearing a new suit. And when I walked into the hospital room, you'd think they let me undress. I am the president. But no, they put me on a gurney and they cut that suit off of me. And the last time I saw it, it was in the corner of the hospital room in shreds. That's why I tell you, if you're ever going to get shot, don't be wearing a new suit. I said, well, thank you, Dad, for that. I'll remind Colleen not to put a new suit out for me in case I'm ever going to be shot. Then he goes on to say, well, that young man who shot me, Hinckley? I say, yes, John Hinckley. Well, I understand his parents are from Denver. Yes, well, I understand the parents, in fact, are in the oil business. I said, yes, they're in the oil business. Well, do you think they have any money? I said, oil business, Denver, I'm sure they have money, Dad. Why? Well, do you think they'd ever buy me a new suit? They never bought him a new suit. That's all he ever wanted was a new suit. But what happens from that point forward? He gets out of his bed, not that day, but before he goes home to the White House, he gets out of his bed and he gets down on his knees. And so many of us, and I'm sure many of you there at the National Association of Christian Financial Consultants, right now, if I asked you to raise your hands, how many of you can recite the Lord's Prayer? I'm sure most of you, if all of you, could do that. But here's the question. How many of you live it? Because my father lived it. Because he got out of his bed and he got down on his knees and he prayed to God forgiveness on John Hinckley for John Hinckley trying to assassinate him. So my father got right with God before he even went home to the White House. And then when he got home to the White House again, he got down on his knees and thanked God for allowing his life to be spared and felt that it was spared for a purpose and spared for a reason that would be opened up to my father in the future. A couple months later, Pope John Paul is felled by an assassin's bullet. He also lives. He's now in the hospital. What does Pope John Paul do before he goes home to the Vatican? Pope John Paul gets down on his knees and lives the Lord's Prayer by asking forgiveness for the man who tried to kill him. Two great leaders, two different areas of the world, both felled by bullets, both live, but both asking God to forgive that person before they got on with their jobs. A couple months later, Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul would meet for the very first time. What do you think they talked about? They didn't talk about freedom. They didn't talk about things you may think they would talk about. They talked about what they had in common. They had in common an assassin's bullet. They had in common the love of God. They had in common now a purpose to change the world. And change the world they did. Working together to bring freedom to Poland and the Eastern Bloc countries. But it was rough on Ronald Reagan because, you see, Ronald Reagan was up against many of his own people who wanted to take a stand not to upset Mikhail Gorbachev. But Ronald Reagan always knew the right thing to do. When he gave the Evil Empire speech, he knew that those listening were in the gulags. That was his audience, not those sitting in front of him, but those in the gulags, knowing that there was a president in the United States that supported their freedom. When he stood before the Brandenburg Gate, his audience was behind him, not the ones in front of him. But the Brandenburg Gate speech was a speech that the State Department never wanted him to give. But he knew it was the right thing to say, tear down this wall. And he did. Back in 1976, when my father lost the nomination to the party, I was with my father that night up in an upper room of the hotel before Gerald Ford came over to tell him who the choice was for vice president. And I asked my father, why did you want to even become president? He said, Michael, for too long I've listened to American presidents sit down with secretary generals of the Soviet Union. And every time we sit down with them, they always ask us to give up something to get along with them. I wanted to be the first president to sit down with the Secretary General of the Soviet Union. And as he was telling me what it was I was going to have to give up to get along with him, I was going to get up from the table, Michael, walk around the other side of it, lean over and whisper in his ear, "Niet." I want to be the first one to say "niet" to a Secretary General of the Soviet Union. We didn't know in 1976 my father was going to run again in 80. But he did, and he won. And guess what? In 1986 in Reykjavik, Mikhail Gorbachev went there under the guise of signing the START agreement. Ronald Reagan went there. State Department went there. Everybody thought Ronald Reagan's legacy was going to be that weekend there in Reykjavik, signing an agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev. That would be the legacy of Ronald Reagan. But you see, Ronald Reagan was not looking to build a legacy. Ronald Reagan was looking to do the right thing for the American people, for those people that he represented. It wasn't about him. It was about all of us. And so when Mikhail Gorbachev said he was going to give up SDI or Star Wars, that's what he wanted Ronald Reagan to do before he would sign. Ronald Reagan said yet. He said no. You've all seen the picture of him turning away in Reykjavik and walking away from that meeting. The media thought Ronald Reagan had lost, but it was the first tile, it was the first moment, the first crack, if you will, that would ultimately bring down the Berlin Wall in November of 1989 and set all those people free. Ronald Reagan always did the right thing. He didn't do it for himself. He did it for others. And that's what your association is all about. Doing the right thing. And not so much for yourself, but doing it for others. We have to all agree here. The world is in turmoil. There's no great leadership either in Washington or any place else. There's no Margaret Thatcher's, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel's, Pope John Paul's, Mikhail Gorbachev's out there. Helmut Kohl's. They're not out there today. Somebody has to take leadership. Somebody has to grab this country and move it forward. As my father once said, when we become one nation, when we forget God, I should say, or forget that we are one nation under God, we'll be a nation gone under. And we are becoming that nation gone under because we're moving God not only out of the classroom, out of our lives completely. And we need to put God back in our lives. We need to start looking up to God instead of down at our shoes. Your association is at the arrow, at the tip of the arrow here. It's about supporting organizations and companies and investing in those companies that have values that share your values. And making those operations grow so those operations, those companies aren't fearful of coming out like Chick-fil-A and saying who they are and what they stand for. We need to stand up for America. Ronald Reagan was a cheerleader for America, and we lost him in 2004. We need cheerleaders again. There is a great void in the world that we live in today of a cheerleader for America, a cheerleader for Christian values. You can be that cheerleader. You can help build a groundswell of support for those values. So once again, we become that nation under God, not a nation gone under. I hope you all have a wonderful conference. I thank you so much for allowing me to join you today in the 3 places that you're at. And I hope to see you again sometime, maybe this time not by video, but actually in person. God bless you, and God bless America.